Okay, that should have fixed it. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start over my last 5 minutes. I apologize. As people who have been to my webinars before know, I'm better with words than I am with technology. Although I'm getting better, and part of that is thanks to FX Street because their technology has improved. And under the tutelage of Maud and Vicky and company, I have improved as well. So all of my improvement is due to them. The topic today, Cyprus, the euro, and the future of the monetary union. As the way I'm going to approach it today is a topic of history and political economy and, if you will, political emotions. The European debt crisis, as it's called, has been said by many people to have started, and I think this is true, to have started out as a debt crisis. It moved and is now as an economic crisis, and we can look at some of the charts that will show this, primarily GDP and unemployment, and is moving into its final stage. And that is as a political crisis. There is an enormous amount, in my mind, of correctness in this. I'm going to briefly explain what I mean, and then I'm going to go through some of the history, not too much. I mean, everyone's aware of 20th century history. The bloodiest history in the history of our planet, and certainly of the Western world, or what did Churchill call history, a record of follies, errors, and miscalculations. That's not the right quote, but it is similar to that. And if there were any more, there were more of those in the 20th century than anything else, of course, abetted by some of the most soul-destroying ideologies to ever raise their head on our planet, aside from that. But there is a purpose to this. So the euro issue has moved from a debt crisis to an economic crisis where it is now to a political crisis. And this is appropriate because there are in my mind, two enormous problems with the euro. One of them is spoken about all the time, and that is that the euro is an attempt at a monetary union without a political and financial union. That is true. But there's a greater one. All the countries involved in the euro are democracies. It is dangerous in a democracy to take large decisions, decisions that affect everyone, whose ramifications are impossible to disguise, and put them through in a non-democratic fashion. The euro, as a monetary union, with a few exceptions, did not consult the majority of the people who now live under the euro. Meaning, the euro was never put to a referendum. Now, you can say that in many of these countries, the euro was enacted by elected governments, and that is true. But don't forget how long ago that was done and how it was sold. And that there really was very little choice. Only, and yes, I see Thatcher, so I'm not going to let it go, a great lady, a great person, and a great leader, with the all-time greats of any political history, because she actually changed the direction of her country and changed it for the better. There will be discussion about this topic, but since I have the microphone, I guess it won't be today. Yes, I understand that. Anyway, she kept the Brits out of the euro. The point being that the bureaucrats, the intellectuals, the elites in Europe who instituted the euro did not consult the people. people is a very nebulous term. It is used by all sorts. In fact, every ruler, from an autocratic king to an autocratic fascist to an autocratic communist to Democrats of all types, they all refer to the people. And what they're generally referring to is their own opinion of what the people are and what the people think. However, in a democracy, it is risky to put through such a project without consulting, in some fashion, the general opinion. In a way, the Euro project was banking on the same bargain that the Chinese government has made with their people, economically speaking, not politically, and not politically speaking. And that is that what we're doing will provide economic growth. It will make things better. That is exactly how the euro was sold. Didn't turn out to be true, but that's how it was sold. So the population is right to feel betrayed, or at least misled. In China, remember, this is an economic comparison only. The government delivers economic growth. It has lifted millions and millions and millions. The policies of the Chinese government have lifted millions and millions and millions of Chinese out of poverty into a much more, if not affluent, at least comfortable lifestyle. But that's their bargain. In China, the bargain is that we will retain political control. And there's relatively little freedom in those things. Of course, freedom is all relative. I'm not going to get into that discussion as much as I would enjoy it. So there's enormous pressure on the Chinese government to maintain growth rates. In Europe, the bargain of the elites was that the euro will improve economic performance, incomes, but that's not happened. And this is where the economic crisis, which is what's going on in many countries. I mean, if you live in Greece, now, all of the countries, and I'm going to go through some of the, you'll see some of the unemployment rates. All of these countries, Greece and Italy and Spain, to a much greater degree than you have here in the United States, have a market, a black market basically. Transactions of economic activity that take place outside the official figures. And to be sure, as unemployment has risen, has skyrocketed actually, and as economic growth, at least in official figures, has plunged, more and more people take their living from the black market. I have friends in many countries in Europe. I mean, this is part of my job here. It's one of the more enjoyable parts of my job, actually. And I ask them, of course, it's an anecdote. It's their story. And I ask them specifically about this. And that's the answer I receive from Spain, from Barcelona, from Italy, from Greece, from Turkey. Not so much Turkey, actually, since we're not really talking about Turkey. That the economic activity, that people's ability to earn money to support themselves is much greater than is depicted in the official figures. Nonetheless, the figures themselves are also relative. If it was a 10% unemployment rate and it's now a 30%, regardless of what you say about the black market and people's ability to work and earn money there, that's a huge difference and a huge change. So even within the relative world of the official figures, the change has been much worse. Okay, let's step back a bit. So we are approaching the economic crisis to the political crisis. And you don't have to look very far to see this. In Greece, the government is hanging on by its threads. In Cyprus, who knows? In Italy, there is and I don't know anything about Mr. Grillo. He may be a very serious man. However, his background is in comedy. On the other hand, the Italians find that very appropriate. Don't forget, last decade, the Italians invented a very well-known porn star, Ciccolina, I think was her name, from Rome to the Italian parliament. I wouldn't say that necessarily brings discredit at all upon the legislative body. In fact, every country has a long history of colorful, interesting people who seek power. So it's really no comment on the Italian political system, except, and this is true, that would be Boris Johnson as mayor of London, or Boris Schlossberg, one of my fellow analysts here in the city. Boris Johnson could very well run for prime minister, although I doubt it, since he's not particularly, I don't think he's well adapted to the political establishment. He is, however, a very witty fellow, and the British have a long and illustrious history of wit and intelligence in their politicians. They value much, because of the makeup and the way the parliament works, they value their ability to actually lead in argument when challenged. The parliament is very much a debating society, and that's very different than the way we do things here in the United States. Different values, similar systems, or at least similar values in different systems, shall we say. So, the political crisis, which is where we are, the only thing I'll say about the variety of people who seek office, it's good, including, as a friend wrote on the chat, Al Franken and Jesse Ventura. And there are far more, if you go back to the 19th century, the list of people in Congress is even more colorful. And you know what? This is good, in my opinion. Who would want to be have their country and their world run only by lawyers and people who were trained in one particular way of thinking and in one particular type of endeavor? To my mind, the greater variety you have in Congress, the better, and the fewer professional legislators you have, the better. Okay, so back to the topic. I will not comment on Mr. Abraham's comment. That is, I assume, his opinion. As the European problem moves to a political level, I, for one, find this completely appropriate. It is the revenge. In fact, I have a column being written on this right now. It is the revenge of the Democrats and the electorate. The elites who pushed through the Euro project with as little consultation as possible, deliberately so, will now find themselves at the mercy of the electorate in a tiny country like Cyprus, or a small country like Greece, or a large country like Spain. And this is because the bargain of the euro has not turned out to be true. In fact, it could never be true. The euro, in concept, in origin, is a political institution. It was conceived, dedicated, and designed to forestall political developments, mainly another war in Europe. Now, I've spoken on this topic before, but it is inescapable when consulting the euro. The origin of the euro, there are ideas of a European currency that go back to before the Second World War. But the specific origin of the euro is in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was in the coal and steel pact between Germany, which was the origin of the EU, leading through the ECU, as far on the financial side, to the ERM, European Rate Mechanism. I mean, as you've heard from me before, I started working in currency trading in 1988 when there were, 17, as opposed to the what we have now in the euro. I mean, 17 countries. There were 17 separate currencies. And, I mean, I remember, trading the Belgian French franc cross and on and on and on. Now, there are two ways. The euro is essentially an imperial project. And there are two ways to conduct a project of this size. One is the way the United States did it. And that is to have a unified country. Because remember, one of the very lively discussions in the late 18th century in the United States between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, when the United States itself appeared to be an agglomeration of sovereign states, was how do you make, and these are people for whom the railroad had not been invented yet. It took months or years to get to the other side of the continent, which wasn't settled anyway. It was essentially an imperial project. In the United States, it was conducted with a uniform devotion to the law and to an ideology, the idea of the United States, that unified, after we got through the Civil War, that unified the country, unified these disparate territories spread apart by enormous communication difficulties and distances. The United States grew, and I understand all of the discussions about the native peoples who were here first. That's not my point here. From the dominant culture in the United States, certainly after the Civil War, and even before the Civil War, there were enormous congruencies about ideas within the United States. So there was an organic growth to it. In Europe, and in the rest of the world, imperial projects are installed from above, usually by military force, by conquest. There are many attributes of that type of project in the euro. It takes decisions. The European Commission, which is the executive of the EU, takes decisions in Brussels amongst themselves. They don't consult the nations that they're dealing with. They instill rules. They promised, as with the Chinese, to provide economic growth and prosperity. They have not. And so now, the financial integrity of the euro is subject to the very decisions of the people that it has both ignored and in many cases derided, as if they did not know what they were talking about. So let's take a look here. Okay. I have so many choices here to look at. Okay. Let's look at the most successful country in the euro, German GDP. Okay? The euro is a huge boon to the Germans. And the euro crisis, you could say, is a huge boom, or has been anyway, a huge boom for the Germans. And why is that? It's because it kept the value of the euro far lower than it would be. The strength of the German economy, the demand for German goods. I drive a Volkswagen. The Germans make very good cars. And many, many other products. The problem is there isn't apparently room for many more than one or two Germanys in the world. There simply is not enough demand for the quality products that Germany produces without creating enormous amounts of extra wealth, which capitalism and the Chinese can do, but it's a very slow process. And it's also true that other people, other countries, other cultures, make products that can compete with the Germans. You can't have the whole... So yes, the low euro has been good for German exports. Of course it has. If my Volkswagen, which I think cost about $25,000 US, if its price had been 50, I probably would not have bought it, despite my thought and experience that it's a very good car. So yes, it does matter. So for the Germans, and don't forget, throughout the last decade, what was happening in Europe was that as the euro was created and as other countries joined it, countries whose economies did not really support the credit rating that they had, their credit rating, of course, came from Germany and the euro, they used that to borrow money, and what do they do with that money? They bought Mercedes, not only, but certainly Germany's greatest export market is the EU itself. So the euro was good for Germany economically. Things are maybe changing now that the austerity that the Germans have insisted on. Also, this gets a great deal of criticism. The austerity that the German governments, and it's not really the German government, it's the German people, because the reason Merkel and her party is insistent upon this is because they have an election coming up and they are politicians. This is where we get back again to the idea it's the revenge of the electorates. They were not consulted. And if things haven't worked out, they will absolutely blame the elites, the politicians, and eventually the euro. So, Angela Merkel has an election coming up. The German view, which is roundly criticized here in the United States and in Europe, very unpleasant pictures of Merkel with all sorts of regalia from the Second World War, is criticized on one topic, of course, that the euro, not the euro, but that austerity is bad for economic growth, especially in countries that have been running enormous budget deficits. And you know what? That is absolutely true. This is the Paul Krugman argument, the New York Times a political columnist. He pretends that he is an economic columnist, but he absolutely is not. He is a political columnist. But that's not the whole story. To take a phrase from the former chief of staff of our president, never let a good crisis go to waste. For Europe, if this particular crisis, at least I think this is part of the thought process in Germany, and to my mind it's accurate, if this crisis is not because the deficits, the productivity, the social service sector in many countries in Europe is unsustainable. You can pretend that it isn't, but it is. It's unsustainable. Their economies do not grow fast enough. They are not productive enough. They don't earn the money to pay for it. So if the government sector in a place like Greece is unsustainable, yet when a crisis like this hits, because you're afraid of damaging perhaps the consensus for the euro, you give in, then whenever, and provide the Greeks with, I'm not picking on the Greeks, it's just that the Greeks are a shining example of this, and it's true. You give the Greeks the loans anyway, and don't ask for anything in return, whenever will it change? You only delay the reckoning. And in the meantime, of course, as Germans and as the German political leaders, you appear, and in many cases are, damaging your own economy. In the future, anyway, by making all these guarantees. This is the same argument. There's an article from George Soros, the ex-currency speculator. Sorry, I remember the days when he was just a currency speculator, and a very good one. He is now, of course, an éminence grise for the world. His idea, of course, is that Germany should back Eurobonds because that's the only way out of this particular crisis. And he's right about that. It is the only particular way out of it. He doesn't get to all the caveats and problems that this would cause and the fact that it really wouldn't solve anything in the long run or even the medium run, not till he gets very much to the end of the article. Mr. Soros had written a number, I think 2 books on sort of some nebulous idea of new political arrangements. I tried reading one of the books. I was not successful. Couldn't quite figure out what he was talking about. Anyway, so yes, the idea from the German point of view, and this is something which is never discussed in all the criticisms that are leveled at Angela Merkel and the Germans, that their austerity assistance is damaging, it's creating unemployment, all of which is true, is that what happens if it isn't done? People who make this argument routinely and, in my mind, deliberately, because most of these people are intelligent, deny the political aspect. They pretend that these economies, and Mr. Krugman is very, very guilty of this. I think he probably likes being used as an example by so many people. I think if you're looking for one columnist, and he's a political columnist, who is cited more in arguments as the shining example of what they disagree with, is probably Mr. Krugman, and that must satisfy him greatly. However, you can't separate the two, and that is absolutely the point of this entire discussion on the euro and on Europe. It is not an economic discussion alone. The decisions are not, they don't have purely economic ramifications. And if and when the euro disintegrates, changes, it will be because of politics, of democratic politics, of exactly the things that the designers of the euro ignored and, in fact, looked down upon. The idea of condescension is a very human one. It is, however, a bad idea in politics because it generally gets discovered. So, a little bit of background here, a little bit of history. We all know the history of the 20th century. Probably the most ideological and the bloodiest century in the history of the world. Details not necessary. To a greater or lesser degree, I'm sure we all know that rather dismal story. I can understand very, very readily. I mean, I'm old enough so that when I was a child, I'm actually thinking of a Kate Bush song. But anyway, I don't know if anyone in Europe knows Kate Bush. She's a British singer. She's very, very good. Anyway, the idea of the Second World War, certainly for my parents, dominated their view of history, and when I was younger, my view of history as well. So the idea that is behind the euro is one that I'm very familiar with. As an American, we have some distance from that. And as an American who has lived and does live in America's imperial age, where many of the things in Europe are, if not ignored, at least the thought process here is that we can do things better and have done things better. That aside, the tragedies of Europe in the 20th century were bound to make its politicians and its leaders and its elites seek for a way to avoid repetition. There's no way around this. How could they, as honorable men and women, do otherwise? And this is where the euro comes from. It is in concept and in purpose a political union. It is a political union to avoid the errors, the horrors of the 20th century, primarily the Second World War. The entire European project was, by its designers, thought to bind Germany to the rest of Europe so that their interests are aligned. So the German militarism would never threaten Europe. Well, they say the road to you-know-where is paved with good intentions. And what has happened over the past 3 years since the Greek crisis blew up is that the system designed to bind Germany to its fellow nations in Europe has created enormous wedges and enormous resentments. Who do the people across southern Europe blame? Well, they blame the Germans. It's not the Germans' fault. But there is an absolute conflict between the idea of unity and the success of unity. I don't know that it would have been possible. I was reading a number of articles in preparation for this about the run-up to the euro. When the Maastricht Treaty was signed, I think in 92 or 93, and then the euro started in 99, and then they started added countries after that. The criteria in the Maastricht Treaty, as with all treaties, looks good on paper. Remember, there were in the 20s, there were a whole series of treaties negotiated in Europe, primarily, I think, the League of Nations. The Locarno Treaty was the culmination of this. They all outlawed war. Everybody signed it, including Germany. Everybody signed them. Outlawed war. We're never going to have war again. The nations of Europe, we didn't sign them here in the United States. The nations of Europe renounced war as a means of settling political disputes. Sort of like the Maastricht Treaty. The Maastricht Treaty had 60% debt limits, and 3% debt limits. Whatever. It's about the only colloquial response you can make to that treaty. As soon as it was necessary for the Germans and the French to abrogate the treaty, they did. They ran deficits higher than that. So, treaties don't make government. If there's anything that's been learned from this process, and since governments have learned this lesson ad infinitum throughout history, we can be assured that within a decade, whatever lessons are learned from this particular crisis will be forgotten and we'll be doing something else. That's a guarantee. There is a certain cyclical nature to history, which is fascinating. The only thing sometimes it seems that really, no, I can't say that. There have been changes, both that are beyond culture, that are beyond technology. So, the euro and the EMU, designed to create a political atmosphere in Europe that would forever prevent war, that would bind Germany and France and the other former enemies to each other, has served to drive them apart. The fate of the euro will be a political fate. I know it always appears, let me bring up Spanish unemployment. It always appears, as certainly in the media and as portrayed, that the euro will collapse at some point because some financial market, the bond market, drives the euro apart. That's not what's going to happen. The governments and I thank you, but I have not written any books. I've written many articles, and some of my articles are in books, but I have not written any books for myself. I'm not sure I'm disciplined enough, but I think I'm going to have to because I have 2 little kids, and I think I'd like to leave them a book. But aside from that, I cry at movies too, so just the way things go. Where was I? Don't distract me about my kids, because then I get a little bit distracted. The euro is always portrayed in the media as if it will be a financial crisis of some type that overturns the euro. The bond markets will drive, Slovenian rates to some astronomical level and the whole euro collapse. That's not what's going to happen. The European governments and the central bank have made it clear that there is no financial effect that they cannot thwart. Look what the Fed and the same in the United States. This year, it's very likely that the Fed is going to buy more bonds of the U.S. government than the government issued. I was speaking to some of our equity traders here, and they were talking about, the U.S. stock market went up 128 points, and the Dow went up 128 points yesterday. And they said, do you think it's a bubble? And my response to that is uniformly the same. If the Fed announced tomorrow that they're stopping QE and they're going to let rates normalize, what do you think would happen? And there's your answer. Of course it's a bubble. So the European governments and the ECB have both made it clear intellectually and their determination, and they have the ability to prevent a financial meltdown in the euro, in European markets. That's not where it's going to end. It's going to end here, on the political side, on the side that Germany and Merkel are addressing when they insist that the governments who have borrowed too much rationalize their finances, at whatever cost. They're not interested in the social cost. My guess is that these are intelligent people. In fact, I know they're intelligent people. I actually have a much higher opinion of most politicians than you might imagine. That the ultimate goal, or the ultimate rationalization, or realization, not rationalization, realization, is that yes, if this unemployment rate that we're looking at here, or this one in France, or this one in Italy, or this one in Portugal, or this one in the EMU. Now, I don't know how the Europeans calculate their unemployment rate. I don't know if they do what the United States does, which is eliminate, if you haven't looked for a job in the last month, which on its face is a crazy way of doing it. I remember when I was looking for a job when I got out of grad school, it took me a year to find the job. A year. And of course, it was 1987, right after the 87 crash. But it took me a year to find a job. So the idea, of course, they say if you haven't looked, whatever. I guess we'll leave that one alone. I don't know how the Europeans calculate their unemployment rate. But if you count here in the United States, people who are employed part-time or actually haven't looked in, say, 6 months rather than 1 month, our unemployment rate is something just like this. It's not 7.6%. It's more like 10 or 12. It's more like 12%. And by other calculations, including some of the participation rates, it's 14 or 15%. So this unemployment rate in the Eurozone. Oh, let's see what else we have here. Greece. You want to really get horrendous? Greece. 30%. Carlos. I will try to do that. We're getting close to the end here. I will try to get to that before we go. But let me just finish my point about the euro and politics. This Greek unemployment rate. Cyprus, and heading much higher. Slovenia, and heading much higher. This is the threat to the euro. The threat to the euro is politics. Let's take Greece, since Greece was the fount of this. The Greek government, which is trying to enforce the terms of the bailouts with the Troika, originally the name of a Russian three-horse sled, is hanging on by its fingernails. The party, Caesarea, I think is how you pronounce it, which is a leftist party, as the Europeans decide these things. We don't really have any leftist parties here in the United States. Don't anybody say anything. Is halfway to an abandonment of the euro as a concept. And that is where the euro will end or change. If the Europeans cannot provide recovery, if they can't provide economic growth, if they can't provide jobs. I ask my friends in Greece, and they say, it's not that bad. And then I say, well, how about this area and that area? And that's where it becomes more descriptive and more unpleasant. But the end of euro will be, if there is an end, and I think there probably will be, I don't see how this continues, when some government, some population, some electorate in Europe, because the euro has not fulfilled its imperial bargain. The benefit, if there is one, of all imperial systems is that they provide peace and some degree of security. They end by their domination, or they diminish warfare, dislocation. That's the greatest benefit of an imperial system. There are many places in the world, Europe was certainly one for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years, where the competing ethnic, cultural, national, religious factions make it almost impossible for there to be any type of overarching peace. How many years did, and I'm not picking on the Europeans, but we are. There are histories like this in many parts of the world. To finally get to a situation where they actually were trying to create a political structure that would prevent the type of wars they've had. Well, it took 2 world wars, the first and the second, to get to that point. This is after thousands of years, and what really happened was that technology advanced enough so that the deaths and the destruction threaten the existence of the civilization itself. You have to get to that point. So the promise of an imperial system, and that's what the European Union, to some degree, but certainly to the concept of a financial imperialism empire that the euro has created. It must deliver that good. Because after all, the emotional attachment that fuels governments. I'm an American. I'm British. I'm Spanish. I'm Italian. The identification we feel with the national entity is not transferred to the imperial center. It's a bargain. And it's a bargain that the... we have to end. Carlos, let me just answer Carlos's question here. It's a bargain that the euro is failing at the moment. Okay, what is happening in the EU is that all of those countries, the former European socialist and communist countries in Eastern Europe that are in the EU, one part of the EU agreement is that they must agree at some future point undetermined, to join the euro. So their question now, and even in many of these countries like Poland, the government still says that it wants to join the euro. So, but the decisions haven't been made, and until they have to actually make the decision, I will refrain from judgment on when they're going to actually do it. Okay, folks, I hope this was interesting. I actually enjoyed this one today. It was a lot of fun. As you know, I like history a great deal, and it's fun to get to use the word empire and imperial in conversation because it's very much out of fashion. So I thank you all very much. If you have any questions, I will put my email address up there. Please send me an email, and I'll be answer to the best of my ability. Thank you all very much, and everyone have a lovely day. And, of course, thank Maud and Vicki for their efforts and their assistance. Today went pretty smoothly. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.